All right, let's get started. Welcome again, and thank you for taking the time to join the City of Kingston's online engagement session for 100-foot park. My name is Nancy Knight, and I'm a communications officer with the Communications and Public Engagement team, and I'm going to be moderating this online engagement session. Today, we also have Julia Morbin behind the scenes. She's going to be helping us with any technical support we might need tonight. For your awareness, this session is live streamed to YouTube and recorded. So to protect your privacy, all participants have their video turned off and you've been muted and the chat functionality in Zoom is turned off. Before we get started tonight, I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. The first being that sometimes technology troubles happen. There's a list of common challenges on Get Involved Kingston, including if your audio or video aren't working. You can also adjust your view options so that you can see both the presentation and the members of the project team at the same time. If for some reason the internet connection goes down, you can call into the meeting at the number on the screen. So please take a moment to write it down just in case. The number is 613-453-5818, and the webinar ID is 833-5839. 3343. You can also follow live on YouTube. So we're going to do our best to help you with any technical problems you might have, but sometimes the easiest way to resolve issues is to log out of Zoom and then rejoin the meeting. And you can do that with the same registration confirmation email that you used to join tonight. If you have any questions at any point during the session, please use the Q&A feature. However, just so you're aware, we will save all of the questions until the Q&A portion of our session that follows the presentation. The Q&A feature can be found on the bar across the bottom of the screen. So to ask a question, simply type into that question area. During the Q&A portion, you can also raise your hand to speak. You can do this by using the raise hand function that can be found by following these steps. Click on that Q&A and a pop-up will appear. You'll see multiple options. Choose the raise hand function. So I'm going to be monitoring for raised hands, so I will acknowledge you and let you know when it's time to turn on your microphone and ask a question or share a comment. Please note that if we don't get to all of the questions, we are going to summarize and post all of those questions on Get Involved Kingston. We're also going to be opening a survey after this meeting where you will have another opportunity to share your feedback. So now on our screen, you'll see the guidelines for participation. So if you've been to a public engagement session with the city before, they might look familiar to you. If there's anything additional you would like to have added to these guidelines, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to pause for a few moments so that you have the opportunity to read those guidelines. Hey, all right, I don't see any hands raised, so thank you. Seeing no objections to the guidelines for participation, we'll proceed into the online engagement session following these guidelines. I'm now going to pass this presentation over to Matt McCombs, the project engineer, to introduce the project team.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us for a presentation of planned improvements at 100-foot Park. I'm Matthew McCombs, a project engineer with Parks and Shoreline at the City of Kingston. I will be the city's project manager for this project. Joining us to listen in this evening is Pittsburgh District's Councillor Bohm. Presenting today are our design consultants for this project: Stu Seabrook, project manager and senior hydrotechnical engineer with Riggs Associates Limited; Rob Snetzinger, environmental consultant with Ecological Services; and Tim McCormick, landscape architect with IBI Group. We are here today to summarize planned park improvements, which will include measures to restore shoreline stability, the replacement of the 2 timber pedestrian bridges, and the replacement of the existing stone stairs leading to Limeridge Drive. Partial funding for the shoreline improvements is provided through Infrastructure Canada's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. In 2019, the City of Kingston was granted $9.8 million in funding from the federal government's DMAP program to address citywide shoreline erosion resulting from changing climate and extreme weather events. The goal of the DMAF suite of 18 projects is to protect critical infrastructure and the community's quality of life along the waterfront. The scope of this project is also guided by Kingston's Waterfront Master Plan, which lays out a strategy for the renewal of public waterfront spaces, including the improvement of waterfront access and connectivity. The plan, which was approved by City Council in March of 2016, presents recommended improvements for 100 Park, including shoreline restoration as well as waterfront connection and access improvements. The concepts you will see here are subject to capital budget approval. The proposed budget is approximately 600,000 K and planned for approval in 2023. If the budget is approved, construction would begin next year in late summer. I'll now pass the presentation on to Stu Seabrook to discuss our plans for the shoreline.
I'm in some trouble with my video, of course. I seem to have lost my video feed here. I'm going to have to do this, I guess. Oh, there we go. Am I on? Okay, looks like I'm there. Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Matt, and thank you for joining us this evening. As Matt had indicated, we've been tasked with looking at some public infrastructure and some shoreline issues at 100-foot Park. The presentation this evening provides a review of our findings to date and our preliminary recommendations to address the issues. Work to date is founded on field investigations, some surveys, and some preliminary desktop analysis of some of the relevant physical processes and the public and ecological functions related to the project area. Next slide, please. So as most of you are probably aware, the park is a relatively long and narrow corridor that extends from Highway 15 to the Greater Cataraqui River. It's a well-treed corridor with a walking path accessed from Highway 15 and also from Limeridge Drive. The pathways terminate at the shoreline, both north and south of a storm drainage channel, which runs from Highway 15 and is conveyed along the central area of the corridor in a rocky channel. The corridor is moderately steep with a fairly well-defined gully associated with that storm drainage channel. And there is residential development bordering on both the north and the south sides of the park. The focus of the project includes specific public park features and shoreline issues, as noted graphically in the slide here. You can see we're looking at the stairs at Limeridge Drive, upper and lower timber bridges, and shoreline erosion north and south of the storm channel. The primary public park features addressed in this project include these wooden bridges and slab stone staircase at Limeridge Drive. They're noted in the slide above, as you can see. And the primary shoreline issues are the erosion along the low bluff shoreline northerly of the storm channel, and some erosion along the southern stacked rock wall shoreline. I'll discuss these issues in subsequent slides. Tim McCormick from IBI will discuss some of the landscape functions. The project will also respect each ecological functions, sensitivities, and opportunities of the area, and those will be discussed further in the presentation by Rob Snetzinger from Ecological Services. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the photos of the shoreline to the north of the storm drain outfall. This shoreline can be described as a low bluff. There is really no formal shoreline protection in this area. And over the past several years, there's been some fairly significant erosion observed. That's especially evident near the southern end of this section. While there are a few mature trees that tend to provide some moderate stabilization to the shoreline soils, the majority of the area along the park and shoreline here, certainly facing, the river, is grassed to the top of the slope. The bluff is slightly higher at the southern portion of the shoreline and has become significantly steepened and undercut due to the erosion. An old tree stump and root system has been persistent in trying to stabilize the shoreline, but the erosion has undercut that root system as well. You can see that southern portion of the shoreline in the top right slide and in the lower right hand two photos. You can see the undercut of the tree, the old stump there in the central lower slide. This area presents a bit of a hazard to the public at present, given the relatively steep vertical drop and the potential instability of the undercut area. The northern portion of this shoreline, you can see in the lower left-hand image there. It's a flatter. It has a few large willow trees that have been more successful in maintaining shoreline stability, but there is evidence of removal of some of the soils around the root system, and much of the ground cover vegetation has been removed locally. The near shore area here is gently sloping with shallow depths and a marginal beach area of sediment and small cobbles that's exposed at normal water levels. Parkland in this area is being lost due to the erosion, and recent years of high water are expected to have been responsible for some acceleration of this loss. And this erosion can be expected to continue without stabilization measures established. Next slide, please. So this slide shows photos of the southern portion. Oh, there we go. It shows photos of the southern portion of the shoreline south of the storm drain outfall. This shoreline would also be described as a low bluff, but it has been formally protected against erosion by a stacked rock wall. The nearshore area, again, is gently sloping with shallow depths. The nearshore material is similar to what we've observed in the last slide, sediment and cobbles. The cobbles here are maybe a little bit larger, likely due to movement of sediment due to the southwest wave attack predominantly. The stack block shoreline has been relatively successful in protecting the shoreline, and in general is in relatively good condition. There has been a loss of some soil from areas immediately behind the rock wall. This is expected to be due to wave overtopping and hydraulic action of waves around the upper rocks. Recent years of high water are expected to have been responsible for acceleration of the problem in this area as well. There are a few instances of the stacked rock wall leaning a little bit towards the shoreline as some of the backfill has been eroded. This loss of soil will ultimately remove sufficient backfill to destabilize portions of the wall, and currently presents a hazard to the public due to the uneven ground and some occasional relatively deep holes that are immediately behind those armor stones. And this observed erosion again would be expected to continue during high water conditions if it's not addressed. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Tim McCormick from IBI to discuss some of the landscape function.
Thanks, Stu. I have the pleasure of sort of walking through some of the other elements not related to the shoreline, but opportunities in the park to provide some improvements and correct some challenges that are going on, specifically related to the bridges and stone steps. We've identified the lower bridge as being the bridge closer to the shoreline as you're walking down the path. This bridge at present has worn deck on top of it, so we're starting to see decay and breakdown of some of the deck materials, which creates an unsafe situation and can cause slipping or breaking. We're looking at what's happening with that one there. There's piers in the channel, which can create a long-term problem. We're starting to see decay and breakdown of some of those piers, which could long-term create a potential for failing of the bridge, which is why we're reviewing this one and opportunities to maybe improve upon it. The railings themselves are not currently to code. When they were installed originally, they would have been. However, as time has gone on, they've now sort of fallen behind on the code, and this is an opportunity to review the actual safety elements of the bridge as well as the railings on the bridge. We are seeing a failing substructure, and that is even more poignant by the fact there was a recent repair that had to be made last year to correct some challenges with the bridge and some failing elements underneath of the substructure, which impacted some of the decking and connections that went on with it. So this is why this bridge is part of this project, is looking at opportunities to improve upon it and create a nicer bridge or better suited bridge for this space, as well as create one that is safe and working for the current standards. Next slide, please. The upper bridge connects to the Limeridge Trail or Limeridge Drive stone staircase. So it's right at the stone staircase and provides a connection there. Just like the lower bridge, this bridge is showing worn decking. It has piers in the channel. And this one even more so has more concerns with the railings. As you can see here, they are chain, offer not a whole lot of stability for going over the bridge and potential safety concerns. And then there is a failing substructure with this as well. And that's just due to the age and nature of the wood that was used to construct these bridges originally. Next slide, please. The stone steps are currently showing some deficiencies and some erosion. Elements we saw in observing sort of reasons for why we're considering replacing these are uneven steps, which is natural. With natural stones, that's pretty common. So these situations are stones where each tread is a different height, so it can make walking up and down them a little more challenging. There's safety concerns with the railings and failing in some of the railings in some cases. And there's been a lot of recent repairs and need for repairs along this area. So part of our review is looking at opportunities to create a safer condition and creating something that is maybe a little easier to maintain in the long term for the city. Next slide, please. I'll turn the presentation over to Rob.
Okay. We've identified several natural features that will need to be considered during the construction phase. Obviously, fish habitat offshore. The quality of the fish habitat is a bit degraded here due to the periodic drawdowns that are required by the Rideau Canal. And there's a number of invasive species that use this particular area, which also degrade the habitat, but it's still fish habitat. The offshore areas contain wildlife habitat features as well. Certain special concern species, which qualify under the wildlife habitat heading. It's also an important stopover site for migratory waterfowl. Shoreline features. The woodlands provide a buffering function that obviously will need to be maintained. And there are turtles that nest on the shoreline areas. The woodland features in the woodland may contain special concern species. We can't confirm that at that point, but there are steps that will need to be taken to mitigate potential impacts in that regard. There's also concerns with, this is not directly related to the project, but there are concerns with sedimentation caused by the nature of the watercourse. Next slide, please. Thank you. Species at risk. All woodlands in Kingston have potential to provide roosting habitat for bats. And of the 8 species of the province, 4 are species at risk. So you can get potentially species at risk bats anywhere in the city of Kingston in a woodland. The probability of that potential goes up if the woodland is older and contains many large old trees. This is not necessarily a large concern because the bats are tolerant to people, but there'll need to be steps taken to make sure that's not going to be a problem. Turtle nesting on the lawn areas is not ideal. There are things that can be done, but turtle nesting will definitely be a consideration during the construction phase to make sure there's no conflict there. There will be need to consult with Department of Fisheries and Oceans because of potential impacts to fish habitat. This is a standard procedure, and there's really not, it'll be relatively simple to navigate. The lower right picture here and the top picture give you an idea of the sedimentation that typically or regularly comes down this creek, and that is potentially something that could be addressed. Significant wildlife habitat, bird breeding habitat, that can be mitigated for, but it again is something will have to be considered with timing restrictions and what have you. Same with turtle nesting. There is no turtle basking directly offshore because there are no basking structures, but the basking structures appear here periodically based on currents and what have you. So that is something that will have to be considered as a potential issue. Again, it can be mitigated for, but it's not something you could ignore. And I leave that to the next person. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So I don't want to dwell too much on some of the technical stuff here, but I was going to go a little bit briefly through some of the background that's, I guess, required in order to come up with concepts for the shoreline protection here. With respect to the factors that are impacting the observed efficiencies, the primary course of the shoreline erosion is wave action, of course. There's typically no significant surface runoff at the shoreline area itself that is contributing to this problem. So the site is somewhat protected from the larger wave conditions that we may see in other areas of the Kingston shoreline. This is due to the limited fetch, which defined as the length of water over which waves might be generated. So there's limited fetch on the Cataraqui River that can reach the site. And also there are typically shallow nearshore areas that tend to break these waves down. There is, however, still some potential for some moderate wave generation from the southwest and the northwest. You can see the fetch arrows in the left-hand image there. A wave analysis has been completed in support of the project, and based on local winds and available open water fetches, a 100-year design wave condition has been defined for the design. The southwest fetch presents the largest potential waves at the site, with an estimate of 0.7 meter wave height in a period of 2.5 seconds. The image on the right represents just some of the wave modeling that we've undertaken. You can see that southwest fetch is a condition that impacts directly on the shoreline, and those being the largest waves and the predominant wind direction in the area is expected to be the predominant source of the problems at the site. Waves from the northwest would tend to run along the shoreline a little bit there, and we're somewhat protected by the nature of the shoreline, but they still would contribute a little bit to the issues at the site. Next slide, please. Also associated with the wave action and impacting erosion are water level variations. As you probably all know, water levels in the Great Lakes vary seasonally. When these water levels are elevated, these waves typically can reach further up onto the shore. And in the case of the shoreline here, the increased water levels permit direct wave attack on the exposed bluff on the north shoreline. You can see that in the upper right image. And the increased potential for wave overtopping of the stacked wall on the south shoreline. You can see elevated water levels in the lower left image from June 2022 there. The image in the top left indicates a typical seasonal variation, and it represents the water levels over summer of 2022. They were falling from a typical high of around 75.2 or 3 down to a low in August of around 74.5. So almost a meter variation in the water levels over the course of the season. And the influence on the shoreline, of course, can be seen in the photos in this image. Next slide, please. Also, I guess, with respect to the influence of water levels on the wave action, you can see typical long-term trends for Lake Ontario in the upper left slide. Interestingly, if you look, you can see 2017 and 19 are reflected in the red lines. These are historic highs for Lake Ontario. So those were particularly bad years, and I think we saw accelerated erosion at the site during that period as well. Long-term low water levels are reflected by the blue dashes here. The images to the right indicate the impact of water levels on wave heights. They may be a little complicated to follow. I'm not certain. The red line in these images represents the wave height. You can see it on the left-hand side of the graph of 0.6 meters roughly at 80 meters offshore, more or less. Black line representing the bed profile and the blue line representing the water level. And those elevations are shown on the right-hand side of the graph. The bottom line is, I guess, as you can see in the upper figure with the 100-year water level, the wave height is sustained fairly high until that wave gets right close to the shoreline. As the water levels drop in the lower two images, you can see that those waves break down much sooner and are dissipated significantly by the time they get to the shoreline. And this impacts, I guess, our consideration of what kind of protection measures we might put in place at this shoreline. Next slide, please. In terms of consideration of structures, there's typically a wide range of considerations for shoreline protection, ranging from fully vegetative options to structural walls to be along the shoreline in cases where we've got significant wave heights, very large wave heights, and lots of hydraulic activity at the shoreline. This site, the North Shoreline, sits somewhere at the lower end of this scale. We do have, as I said, relatively small wave heights to deal with relatively low periods. The wave heights are too significant, in my opinion, to be protected with just a vegetation option. So we're looking at an option that includes some form of beach anchoring and some vegetative options as well. The southern shoreline is already protected, of course, with that stacked rock wall. We don't propose to make any significant changes in that area. What we would look to do is look to make some modifications in that area to help protect against overtopping. Next slide, please. This would represent a typical concept consideration that we're looking at further right now for the northern portion of the shoreline. It includes a rock sill to anchor the beach. That rock sill would be integrated into the local beach, so a lot of it would be buried so that we're not looking at a significant pile of rock along the shoreline, but it would be in there in place in order to protect against erosion of the upper slope during periods where we might experience some erosion along that section. The rock sills would be largely buried. Steep slopes will be flattened and they would be vegetated with species to provide some stabilization of the shoreline through their root structures and to provide some habitat enhancement. We would also look at potential to provide a point of public access within this section of shoreline, as it is an area that is relatively frequently accessed by the public along the park area. Next slide, please. Along the southern shoreline, as I said, we have a stacked rock wall in place that is in relatively good condition. We would look to reset some of the stones that have been marginally displaced in order to reconstruct that wall. And we would need to come up with some measure of protecting the area immediately behind the wall against erosion due to overtopping, causing the problem that we see there on site now. Typical approach to this would be a rock splash apron that we would construct immediately adjacent to the wall. An example of that you can see in the lower right-hand slide here. This is in Kingston along the Mullet Path. Something like this would provide material that's more resistant to erosion in the event that high water occurs and we do get some overtopping. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back to Tim now for some discussion of some of the landscape solutions.
Thanks, Stu. For this section here, again, I'm going to focus in on the bridges and put this slide back up as a bit of a reminder, just so we know when we're talking about the lower bridge and upper bridge and the stone stairs, where they're located, and just sort of tie back to where they are in the park. Next slide, please. So in our preliminary review, we've started to look at opportunities for bridge improvements at both the upper and lower locations. The lower bridge, critical part are really looking at improving the decking and railings. That's one of the critical parts here, is improving safety and improved user safety throughout the whole use of the bridge and tie-ins on those edges, as well as on the bridge itself. This may include some abutment improvements, so abutments being the elements that anchor the bridge on either end, trying to find opportunities to minimize erosion and really hold the bridge in place if there are flooding and situations that may occur in the channel. For the lower bridge, we're looking at a potential realignment. This is an opportunity to maybe shorten the crossing as well as orient it just a little bit more square on the channel. We recognize why the bridge is put where it was, as it ties in nicely to the trails and works as sort of the most direct route, but looking at opportunities to see what is the right answer as we go through it. So an opportunity to maybe have an alignment. The other part we're looking at is really less footings in the channel. Currently, the footings or piers that come down and touch into the water. We're looking at how we might be able to span this without having to have those footings in the water area, which will create a longer lasting bridge and minimize maintenance requirements overall. So that's one of the bigger elements we want to try to do through the treatment in this area. We'll also be looking at opportunities to improve the trail on, tying back into the shoreline work on the other side of the bridge and trying to make sure that everything we're cleaning up as we go through this area and tidying up anything in loose ends in the trail where we can, or the park where we can. The upper bridge improvements, very similar in nature, where we're looking at improving the decking and railings, the user safety, abutment improvements, and again, less footings in the channel. So very similar. That bridge there is basically the location where it needs to be. So it basically be replacing it from where it is currently. One of the challenges we know we're going to face with this is going to be material and treatment, because it is a very challenging area to get materials into. So our work will likely maintaining the use of wood, and the size of wood will be pretty critical to make sure that we can actually get it down the pathway safely and minimize any impacts of a heavier equipment need. So it'll basically be trying to do this in a situation where we can minimize the overall impact of having the bridges reconstructed on site. Next slide, please. So the stairs themselves, we're reviewing the orientation of the stairs. We recognize that the stone stairs, have been there for a while, and we want to minimize the impact to the adjacent areas around. So minimizing impacts to any existing trees or the slopes around it. So the stairs themselves will likely follow a fairly similar location. We're going to be looking at opportunity to improve safety through the use of concrete or materials that are there, so we can actually look at that, and having steel railings. So again, elements that are going to have long-term strength and minimize the maintenance requirement within this area. Concrete's great in the fact that we can uniformly create the treads and make sure that it's actually standardized, so it makes it easier and safer for people to use. And as I said, the biggest thing here is minimizing the long-term maintenance and replacement costs. The hope is we can design and implement something that's going to be there for a long time. We do recognize that the existing rock stairs, there's natural stone there, and we're going to be looking for any opportunity to reuse those in retaining walls or accents along this area where we need to try to minimize the need to take that material off site. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you everybody for your great presentations. We're going to move right into our question and answer session. So as a reminder, you're welcome to add your questions into the Q&A, and I will read them out loud for our team to answer. You're also welcome to raise your hand. I'll be watching for this, and I'll acknowledge you and let you know when it's time to unmute and ask your question. Another item to note is that if we don't get to all of the questions tonight, please know that we will answer all of your questions on our Get Involved Kingston project page. And there will also be an opportunity for you to complete an online survey before November 23rd to share any additional comments you might have. That survey will be posted on the project page as well. All right, so we can get started. We already have a couple questions lined up here. So the first question is from Helga. They've said there's no mention of benches. The bench on the north side is crooked and therefore not comfortable to sit on. A bench on the south side would be very nice. And a garbage can at the river end of the park would cut down on the amount of garbage left. Can I ask the speakers to comment on that?
I can comment on that. So thank you very much, Helga. We did recognize that the existing bench was in relatively poor condition. While we focused primarily with this presentation on the larger components of this project, there are pathway connection improvements that are being considered as part of this scope. and we can take that suggestion away and look into these types of opportunities as we move forward. I would say that a new bench is likely outside of our current scope, but again, we can take that away and look into it. And same for garbage cans, not within our current scope, but a great suggestion, and we can look into it further.
Thank you, Matt. The next question is from Nan. First, they're truly delighted to know that this work to save the shoreline and trees will be done. The question relates to the mouth of the stream at the point of the lower bridge. It appears that years ago, thick landscape fabric was used in the stream bed, but has been partially dislodged long ago and yet remains in the stream bed and is an eyesore. Also, a concrete pyramid with an old iron pipe and other discarded items are found in the stream bed. Will you be cleaning up the stream bed and other junk along that shoreline?
I can answer that one as well. Thank you very much for that suggestion. So there currently aren't any plans to more broadly renovate the park or clean the valley or dredge the river. But we'll look into the creek bed and debris near the bridge areas where there might be an opportunity, for some potential localized works associated with the bridges that we're replacing.
Thanks, Matt. I see that we have a raised hand. Liz, you're welcome to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Did that work? Okay, thank you. I'm late to the party, so some of the things that I wanted to raise may be irrelevant, but I'd like to put them out there. I use that park about 3 times a week, and I love it. I think it's beautiful. I actually thought it was Butternut Creek. I didn't know it was a storm drainage channel. I suspect it is Butternut Creek that's sort of been buried. At any rate, there's a lot of senior citizens who live in the area, and the lower part of that path is so steep that you can't go down there if you're on a mobility scooter, which I know makes some people very sad. And I'm not on a mobility scooter, but it's scary for me to even walk down there. I mean, I'm getting better at it, but I kept thinking, even a handrail, not unlike the designs you're showing for the bridges, could make a powerful difference of adding safety. Like a scooter user could actually probably hold on to that and maybe slow down the risk of heavy equipment going too fast. So that was my first most important point, was around accessibility. Secondly, I too was hoping that the bench could be at least straightened up, but even more importantly, closer to the shore so you can actually see the swans and what's going on. So even if you can only move that bench and incorporate it in the firmer structure that you've shown us as future possibilities, that just seems to be great. And of course, ideally a picnic table. I was kind of thinking a kayak put in, something like that in the long term, but I guess that's all beyond the scope. And I just wanted to mention that there are definitely deer down there regularly, in addition to, and there's basking structures recently because of the low water. So all of that junk that people are talking about, I've also seen turtles out there. So I like what you're talking about in terms of strengthening the edge. For sure, it feels dangerous. And I think if you put up some vegetation along that riparian edge, it would also keep the geese out of there, because right now it's just straight grass and it's just like a magnet to the geese, and therefore the slippery poop and those crumbling edges do indeed make it dangerous. Anyhow, I just wanted to say that, and I'm glad you're working on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Go ahead, Nancy.
All right, so I will move on to the next question from Alex. This is a 2-parter, so I'm going to break it up here. The first part of the question is, what type of heavy machinery will be used? The North Shore is really not accessible.
Do you want me to answer that, Matt? Yeah, so I guess we'd have to look at mini size excavation equipment and haulage units. You're right, it is a very difficult site to access, and that's certainly one of the challenges in coming up with the design. So there's no way we're going to be able to get monstrous excavators and dump trucks down to the site. So materials that we'll be looking at in terms of the shoreline restoration will be relatively small, I guess, in terms of some of the rock that you might see around some of the other Kingston shorelines. Again, I guess we're helped by the fact that it's a relatively limited wave exposure here, but we're looking at material a couple of feet in diameter, perhaps, in terms of some of the rock berms and whatnot. So we can take care of that with some of the smaller excavation equipment that we might be able to get down the pathway.
Thanks, Stu. Alex has also just added another comment here that goes along with that first question, and that is the steps will be a challenge to get machinery in, care needs to be exercised. So thank you for that comment, Alex. The second part of the question here is about timelines. So Alex has asked, when will the work be undertaken and how long of a period for construction?
So I talked a little bit about the timing for the start of construction at the beginning of the presentation. Construction depends on budget approval at the capital level, and then that could begin if it's approved. Then we could start construction, beginning next year in late summer. As for the length of work, there are in water work timing windows that we have to adhere to, so be likely limited to that, and that's pretty much the fall season. Unless Stu has something to add about construction timing, it's something that'll we'll get more into the schedule as we go into future phases of the project.
Yeah, typical in-water work periods are July to September-ish. So other, I guess, park upland works could be carried on outside those windows, but we do have limitations in what we can do in the water.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Ryan. Has accessibility been considered as much as possible?
In terms of accessibility, there was a project undertaken a little while ago for improvements. Unfortunately, we're in a steep ravine setting, which does make accessibility challenging to achieve. And I think Neil's on the call. He might be able to speak more to previous works completed on site to improve accessibility.
Thanks. Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thank you, Councillor Boehm. So I think with regards to the current project scope, which is the 2 footbridges and the staircase, yes, they will be fully FADS compliant. For the other residents in the call, that's our accessibility design standards for the city. So staircases, even though you obviously can't take a mobility device, a wheeled mobility device down them, they still have a whole parameter of accessibility considerations: the height of the treads, what you see if you have a visual impairment, how the handrail works, the size of the step as you go up or down. So yes, accessibility will be fully integrated into the features of the park that this project is addressing, which again are those 3 sort of structures, the 2 little footbridges and the staircase. With regards to the shoreline and any pathway improvements, where we do expect to see pedestrian movement, in a natural environment, we are sometimes held to that site condition, as Matt mentioned. So we'll make every effort to improve the accessibility where we are doing pathway improvements, in particular the North Shore, and there's the tilting bench. But that's the limit of the scope of the project. As far as previous work that was done, it was quite a while ago actually now. We worked very hard to improve the accessibility of this site and the pathway system that runs through the park. And while it's very steep now, it's actually a lot less steep than it used to be. So a lot of improvements have been made, and there's no scope in this project to address the sort of uphill pathway situations. I did hear a question about potentially adding some additional handrails in the really steep section. So we're gonna have a look at that. But I think that beyond something like that, we might be stepping outside of the scope and the budget of the proposed project. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. So we have a comment from Nan. I'm just going to read it out loud so everybody can hear. They have said that the residents of Medley Court build turtle shelters over the places where the turtles lay their eggs each spring, and when the hatchlings appear, watch for them and move them, especially if they are on the street, and carry them down to the shoreline. We're happy to cooperate with you in any way to protect wildlife and bird life. So we have captured this information, and we'll make sure that we reach out if we do need any community support. There's also now another comment that might be beyond the scope of our project, but Elizabeth has asked, who do we speak with and how do we follow up about possible signage that would inform the public about shoreline and encourage environmental practices like taking out your own garbage? So I'll put that out to the speakers if you'd like to comment, but I will also say, Elizabeth, that we can reach out to you separately after this meeting to offer some ideas on how we could who you could contact about that. All right.
Nancy, if I can offer a comment, I think that's a great idea, the last question you read, and we're actually addressing something like that in a nearby area on Butternut Creek. We do have a natural area signage program that's already been developed. So I just emailed it to Matt. So when we complete this project, if the project budget is approved by council in 2023, I think we could probably take on some of that messaging. So we'll certainly put it on our potential to-do list. Thanks.
Can we jump in? Just a quick question. The suggestion by having the citizens group come down and identify turtle nesting areas is an excellent one, because they're on the ground there every single day. And if a snapping turtle comes in, for a short period of time, you're not going to know they've nested there. So that'll be extremely helpful to the team. We need to mitigate around that. We don't want to be disrupting an active nest.
All right, thanks everyone. I do see a comment from Liz in response to the conversation about the steep areas at the park. They have just added that for older residents who are balance challenged, a handrail would help for sure. So Liz, we have captured that and we'll include that in our engagement summary. I am going to just pause for a moment. I don't see any other questions coming in, so we'll just give you a moment in case there are more questions. Okay, I am not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm just going to move to our last slide tonight. Thanks again to everybody for participating. We're so happy you made the time and you shared your comments about the project. Apologies, we actually do have one more question. Alex, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all nods. Yes, it's Alex, and just to provide some comments in terms of the lay of the land as a park, as well as the shoreline. Indeed, there are snapping turtles nesting here. I have caught largemouth bass off the rock wall. There are geese and waterfowl, and we do have lots of bats as well. So it's there's quite a small park, but it's very unique. The one thing that is you should be aware of, I believe that Medley Court, when it was constructed and the park was created, the rock wall that's at the water's edge continues up through the ravine, and there's a significant series of rock walls in the park. And we have a large number of students from the local high school that come and visit there. And they are crossing or entering that park, not via the pathway, the entrance, but they're coming around. There's a little mini mall. They're coming around the fence and entering via that site, and they're jumping down those very, very large walls of rock. And in terms of safety and maintaining the integrity of the property from between the park, the mall, and Medley Court, there is a chain link fence, and I would think it would be appropriate to make sure it's closed off so there's consideration for safety. And Matt, you've received my comments, and I'm going to go further than that. But you should also note that the shoreline area of this area is actually a portion of the provincially significant wetland for the Cattaraugus River, just so that everybody's on the same page when dealing with it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I've received your note there about the gap in the chain link fence, and we'll look into it further. Sure.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. Before we wrap up tonight, we would really appreciate it if you could take a second to complete a poll and let us know how we did tonight. And while you're completing that poll, I have a couple more items to note. The reporting back, as I said, for this engagement is going to be posted on the Get Involved Kingston project page. That will include all of the questions and comments from tonight's session. If you have signed up to receive updates about this project, you'll be notified when that engagement summary is published on the site. But if you haven't signed up, please reach out to Matt and ask to be added to that project list. Lastly, we invite you to visit Get Involved Kingston and share any additional comments you have about this project before November 23rd. The website link for that is getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca/100-foot-park. We'll just give that poll another moment, and then we'll wrap up for today. Thanks very much, everybody. All right, everyone, thanks again, and we hope you have a great evening.